Tel Aviv just got hit again. Not rockets, not drones, ballistic missiles. The same city that Iran emptied of interceptors on the night the magazines ran dry got hit again. And this time the air defense response was not a near miss, not a partial intercept, not two interceptors that engaged late and missed. This time there was functionally nothing, no intercept attempt that failed, no late sirens that gave partial warning. The second strike on Tel Aviv went through the defensive layer with a completeness that the first strike did not achieve, because the first strike taught Iran exactly what remained of Israel's intercept capacity over the city. And the answer Iran found was not enough to matter. The people of Tel Aviv sheltered where they were told to shelter. They did what they had been instructed to do. And the missiles came in anyway. That is the situation as of this morning. In the next several minutes, I will show you exactly how Iran structured the second strike differently from the first, what the absence of any meaningful intercept response tells you about the current state of Israel's defensive coverage over its largest population center, what the Israeli government has and has not told its civilians about why this is happening, and what a second uncontested strike on Tel Aviv means for where this war goes from here. To understand why the second strike on Tel Aviv is strategically more significant than the first, you need to understand what the first strike actually established. Not what the Israeli government said it established, but what it actually established in the operational record of this conflict. The night Iran's missiles reached Tel Aviv unchallenged, the immediate public framing from Israeli officials was that the event was an anomaly, an exceptional outcome produced by an unusual convergence of factors, a temporary degradation of coverage that would be addressed. The implicit promise behind that framing was that the first uncontested strike on Tel Aviv was a one-time failure in a system that was otherwise working and would be restored to full function. The second strike destroys that framing completely. A second uncontested strike on Tel Aviv is not an anomaly, it is a pattern, and a pattern has a cause that is structural rather than situational. A pattern means the first event was not exceptional. It was the first instance of a condition that has now recurred, and when the condition recurs over the same city within days of the first occurrence, the question the government cannot defer any longer is not whether the system failed, it is whether the system can be restored on a timeline that provides any meaningful protection to the people currently living in that city. The cause of the pattern is not difficult to identify for anyone who has been following this conflict honestly. Israel's interceptor stockpile over Tel Aviv was drained by a deliberate Iranian attrition campaign across the first weeks of this conflict. That campaign was not a secret. It was visible in the consumption data, in the daily intercept counts, in the wave spacing and weapon mix Iran employed night after night with mathematical precision. The campaign was designed to produce a specific arithmetic outcome, a point at which the interceptor supply fell below the threshold required to provide comprehensive coverage over Tel Aviv. Iran reached that point. That point was the first uncontested strike, and then Iran demonstrated with the second strike that the point has not moved. The replenishment timeline for Tamir interceptors, the munitions the Iron Dome system fires, is measured in months, not days. Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, even operating under emergency surge manufacturing conditions with American financial support, produces interceptors at a rate measured in hundreds per month. The consumption rate during sustained high-intensity bombardment is measured in hundreds per day. That gap does not close in the days between the first and second uncontested strike on Tel Aviv. It does not close in the weeks either, at the operational tempo Iran is maintaining. It closes on a timeline that is completely disconnected from the pace of this conflict, which means the second strike on Tel Aviv was not just predictable. It was mathematically certain the moment the first strike established that the intercept capacity over the city had been depleted below the threshold needed for comprehensive coverage. Iran knew that. Israeli defense planners knew that. The Israeli civilian population was not told. The information gap between what the operational planning documents inside IDF commands describe about the current coverage reality over Tel Aviv and what the government's public guidance tells civilians about their protection is not a technical complexity gap. It is not information that is too complicated for civilians to understand. It is information that is straightforwardly alarming, and the government has made a decision that the alarm would be more damaging than the ignorance. The second uncontested strike on Tel Aviv is the outcome of that decision. Now let us talk about how Iran structured the second strike, because the tactical differences between the first and second engagement tell you something important about how Iran is learning and adapting in real time, and what that adaptive capacity means for every major Israeli city currently operating under depleted coverage conditions. The first strike that reached Tel Aviv unchallenged was the inevitable arithmetic outcome of a consumption curve crossing a supply curve. It succeeded because there was nothing left to stop it, not because it was specifically designed to defeat whatever remained. It was attrition reaching its logical conclusion. The second strike was different in structure and timing in ways that reveal a level of operational learning that deserves serious analytical attention. After the first uncontested strike, Israeli defense authorities began an emergency redistribution of remaining interceptor assets from lower priority coverage areas toward Tel Aviv to restore some level of defensive capacity over the city. Emergency logistics movements of that kind are not instantaneous. They require transport, positioning, system integration, and test protocols before redistributed assets are fully operational. The window between when redistributed assets begin moving toward Tel Aviv and when they reach full operational status is not a secret to anyone with detailed knowledge of Israeli logistical protocols, and Iran has demonstrated throughout this conflict that it has detailed knowledge of Israeli operational protocols. Iran assessed that window. Iran struck inside it. The second strike on Tel Aviv arrived during the period when the redistributed interceptors had not yet reached full operational status over the city. That is not luck. That is intelligence-driven targeting. It represents a level of situational awareness about the internal state of Israel's defensive architecture that should concern every analyst watching this conflict. Iran is not just firing missiles at Israel. Iran is watching the Israeli defensive response, assessing the timelines of that response, and timing its strikes to exploit the specific gaps that the response itself creates. That is an adversary operating inside the Israeli decision cycle, not reacting to Israeli actions after they occur, anticipating Israeli responses before they complete, and striking into the gap. The weapon mix Iran used in the second strike also differed from the first in ways that reflect operational learning layered on top of the timing intelligence. Iran used a higher proportion of Fattah series maneuvering re-entry vehicles in the second Tel Aviv salvo compared to the mix it had been using in previous engagements. The Fattah missile's terminal phase maneuverability is specifically designed to defeat the fixed ballistic trajectory intercept solutions the Patriot and Arrow fire control systems generate. When a maneuvering re-entry vehicle alters its trajectory in the terminal phase, it invalidates the intercept solution the system has already calculated, forcing a new calculation on a timeline that the intercept window may not provide. The reason Iran increased the proportion of maneuvering warheads in the second Tel Aviv strike is directly related to what the first strike revealed. The first strike showed Iran that whatever residual intercept capacity remained over Tel Aviv after the depletion campaign was concentrated in the upper-tier systems, Arrow and David's sling assets that had been partially preserved because they handle the longest range and highest altitude threats. Those systems are the ones most vulnerable to maneuvering re-entry vehicles because their engagement geometry is optimized for predictable ballistic trajectories at high altitude. By increasing the Fattah proportion in the second strike, Iran specifically targeted the vulnerability of the residual intercept assets rather than relying on depletion alone to achieve penetration. That is a two-level adaptive strategy. Level 1. Deplete the lower-tier assets through sustained attrition over the first weeks of the conflict. Level 2. Defeat the upper-tier residual assets through maneuvering warheads that exploit the engagement geometry vulnerability those systems carry. The two levels work sequentially. The first level creates the conditions the second level exploits. And executing the strategy at this level of precision requires Iran to have a detailed enough picture of Israel's defensive architecture to know which assets remain after depletion, which layer they operate in, and which specific vulnerability to target. That picture exists. It is being used, and the Israeli government's public communication has not addressed where it came from, how complete it is, or what it means for the security of every other major Israeli population center whose coverage profile Iran has been observing with the same intelligence apparatus that produced this morning's targeting solution. The civilian impact of the second Tel Aviv strike is the dimension of this story receiving the least adequate coverage relative to its importance to the millions of people living in that city and every other Israeli city now operating under the same depleted coverage conditions. After the first uncontested strike, the Israeli government maintained its standard public guidance. Go to the shelter when the siren sounds. The shelter will protect you. The system is being restored. That guidance was maintained through the entire period between the first and second strikes, through the emergency redistribution logistics, through the window Iran was watching and targeting, through the morning when the redistributed assets had not yet reached operational status. It was maintained without any public acknowledgement that the redistribution window existed, that the assets had not yet reached operational status, or that the coverage over Tel Aviv during that specific period was lower than the guidance implied. The people of Tel Aviv who followed that guidance during the second strike sheltered where they were told to shelter and experienced the outcome that the actual coverage state produced, not the coverage state the public guidance described. The coverage state the operational documents described. The coverage state that existed in the planning rooms and was not communicated to the population it was supposed to protect. That gap between the guidance civilians received and the defensive reality that existed is the most consequential communication failure in the history of this conflict, because it is the second time it has occurred over the same city. A communication failure that recurs is not a failure, it is a policy. The psychological impact of the second strike is categorically different from the first in a way that matters for every dimension of this conflict going forward. The first uncontested strike on Tel Aviv was shocking because it was unprecedented. An uncontested strike on Tel Aviv had not happened before. The shock contained within it a residual hope, unstated but present, that the event was exceptional, that the system that had protected Israeli cities for years was experiencing a temporary degradation that would be corrected. The resilience that Israelis have demonstrated throughout every previous conflict was built partly on confidence that the defensive architecture was fundamentally reliable, even when it was imperfect. The second strike removes that hope. Not partially, completely. When the same city takes two uncontested ballistic missile strikes within days of each other, the civilian population is not left with uncertainty about whether the system will be fixed. They are left with the question of whether it can be fixed on a timeline that means anything for their immediate safety. And that question has an honest answer that the government is not providing. The honest answer is no, not on the timeline that matters. The manufacturing and logistics reality of precision interceptor production means the timeline for a full restoration of the stockpile depth that provided Tel Aviv's pre-conflict coverage is weeks at minimum, and more realistically, months. The daily consumption rate under the current operational tempo consumes any partial replenishment as fast as it arrives. The gap between when comprehensive coverage can be restored and when the next Iranian strike will arrive is not a gap that closes through emergency logistics. It is a gap that exists in the operational planning documents and that Iranian targeting planners are aware of and will continue to exploit as long as the current operational tempo continues. The political consequences of the second uncontested strike on Tel Aviv are landing in real time, and they are compounding the pressure that the first strike created in ways the government's communication strategy cannot absorb. Netanyahu's government is now in the position of having failed to protect the country's largest population center not once but twice in the same conflict. The questions that followed the first strike — why were stockpiles not larger? Why was production capacity not expanded earlier? Why were radar systems allowed to be destroyed without a faster response? — are now being asked with significantly greater urgency and significantly less patience. And new questions are being added to them. Why was the second strike not stopped when officials said the defensive coverage was being restored? What specifically was the state of interceptor assets over Tel Aviv at the time of the second strike? Were civilians told the coverage had been restored when it had not? Were civilians told the redistributed assets were operational before those assets had reached operational status? These are not questions being asked gently. They are being asked by Knesset members with access to classified briefings, by military correspondents with sourcing inside IDF commands, by millions of Israeli civilians who have now watched the government's most fundamental promise to them fail twice over the same city within the same conflict. Netanyahu was already governing under maximum domestic political stress before this morning. His corruption trial is ongoing. His pardon request was formally rejected. His poll numbers have deteriorated throughout the duration of this conflict. The election timeline he was managing toward has not produced the political consolidation the campaign was partly designed to generate. The military operation described on day 4 as quick and decisive is now in its 4th week, with Iran still launching missiles at Tel Aviv, Hezbollah still firing from Lebanon, and the country's largest city having taken 2 uncontested strikes without meaningful defensive response. The political pressure generated by 2 uncontested strikes on Tel Aviv is not pressure that can be managed through communication strategy or by pointing to offensive successes elsewhere in the campaign. Those successes are real. The strikes on Iranian missile infrastructure, the degradation of Iran's launch capacity in the western regions, the destruction of Hezbollah resupply routes — these are genuine operational achievements. And they coexist with the second uncontested strike on Tel Aviv in a way that neither cancels the other. The public can hold both facts simultaneously, and the fact they are holding more tightly this morning is the one about their largest city. There is a broader strategic question that the second Tel Aviv strike forces into the open that the first strike allowed the government to defer. That question is about the fundamental viability of the current military strategy in the absence of comprehensive air defense coverage over Israel's largest population centers. The strategy has been premised on the ability to conduct offensive operations against Iranian military infrastructure, while the defensive architecture absorbs the retaliatory strikes at a level of effectiveness that keeps civilian casualties below the threshold that collapses public support for the campaign. That premise requires the defensive architecture to be capable of providing meaningful protection to civilian population centers throughout the duration of offensive operations. The first uncontested strike on Tel Aviv created serious doubt about that premise. The second uncontested strike on Tel Aviv destroys it. You cannot sustain a military strategy premised on offensive operations while the civilian population center those operations are supposed to be ultimately protecting is taking uncontested ballistic missile strikes. The political pressure generated by each uncontested strike accumulates in a way that offensive successes do not offset. The people watching their city take missiles do not balance that experience against a missile storage facility destroyed in western Iran. They balance it against the promise that their government would protect them and the reality of 2 consecutive failures to do so. Iran designed for this dynamic. Iran's attrition campaign across the first weeks of this conflict was not designed to win a military engagement in the conventional sense. It was designed to reach this specific political pressure point, the point at which the Israeli government is sustaining offensive operations against a backdrop of uncontested missile strikes on its own largest city, and the political foundation that sustains those offensive operations is visibly eroding in real time. Iran knew that point existed. Iran calculated where it was. Iran structured the attrition campaign to reach it at a specific tempo. And this morning's second uncontested strike on Tel Aviv is the event that confirms Iran has reached it. The open question that the second uncontested strike on Tel Aviv leaves hanging over this conflict is the one that neither Jerusalem nor Washington has been willing to answer publicly, because answering it honestly requires confronting the gap between what this campaign was said it would achieve and what it has actually produced. How many more times can Iran hit Tel Aviv with no meaningful defensive response before the political foundation sustaining this campaign collapses entirely? The answer is not 0. Israeli resilience is real, and the population's capacity to absorb adversity while maintaining support for necessary defensive action is historically demonstrated. But the answer is also not unlimited. There is a number, and Iran is counting toward it with the same mathematical precision it applied to the Interceptor attrition campaign. The second uncontested strike is 1 step closer to that number than the first, and the gap between the 2 steps was not weeks. It was days. That tempo is the most important number in this conflict right now, not the size of the Iranian missile stockpile, not the number of Israeli strikes on Iranian facilities. The tempo at which Iran can deliver uncontested strikes on Tel Aviv, and the speed at which each one moves the political situation closer to the point where the offensive campaign cannot be politically sustained. Iran knows that number, Iran is managing toward it, and the Israeli government is managing a political environment in which the honest answer to the question, when can comprehensive coverage over Tel Aviv be restored, is not available on a timeline that helps with any of this. Thanks for watching. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If Iran timed the second Tel Aviv strike specifically to the window when Israel's redistributed interceptors had not yet reached operational status, what does that level of intelligence about Israel's internal defensive timelines tell you about what Iran already knows about every other major Israeli city's current coverage gaps? And at what point does a government that has watched its largest city take 2 uncontested ballistic missile strikes have to publicly acknowledge that the military strategy it is sustaining cannot protect the population it was designed to defend? Let me know below. Subscribe and like the video if you want to stay on top of this. I will see you in the next one.